The porcelain vase shattered at my feet, and before the echo of the crash even faded, Cassian Vale's mother was already screaming. It was a high, piercing sound that cut through the quiet of the morning like a serrated blade. I stood there, frozen, my hands still reaching for the empty air where the priceless heirloom had been just a second ago. The floor was wet. I had been mopping it carefully, just as I was told, but my foot had slipped on a patch of wax that shouldn't have been there. I tried to catch the vase as it tipped from the pedestal, but it was too heavy, too smooth, and far too fragile for a girl with tired, overworked hands. Mrs. Vale didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask how it happened or notice the small cut on my ankle where a shard had jumped up and bit my skin. She didn't care that I had worked 14 hours the day before without a single break. To her, I wasn't a person. I was just a tool that had finally malfunctioned. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at the jagged white shards scattered across the Italian marble and announced, loud enough for the entire estate to hear, that I was fired. Her voice carried into the hallway, drawing the attention of the other staff, who watched from the shadows with pitying eyes. But she didn't stop there. She claimed that my final paycheck would be docked to teach me respect for wealth. It was a cruel lie. That paycheck was all I had for rent and food, and we both knew the vase cost more than a year of my salary. She just wanted to watch me suffer. Cassian, her son, watched the whole scene from the grand staircase. He had his arms crossed over his chest, a smug smirk plastered across his face as if this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. He wasn't just a witness, he was enjoying the show. I saw a few of his friends standing behind him. Someone laughed. Someone else held up a phone, filming my humiliation for a social media post that would surely go viral by sunset. Then Cassian said it, half joking, half cruel. "Careful, Maeve. That vase cost more than your entire life." The sting of his words was worse than the firing. That's when the title became my reality. I was the poor maid, a girl whose life was worth less than a piece of baked clay. My chest burned with a mixture of shame and hot, bubbling rage. My ears rang with the sound of their laughter. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I simply turned around and walked out of the mansion with nothing but my small bag and my dignity. Cliffhanger. As the heavy iron gates began to creak shut behind me, Cassian called out one last time, his voice dripping with malice. "You'll never touch this world again, Maeve. Remember your place." My name is Maeve Rowan, and contrary to what the Vales believed, I didn't always scrub floors for people who despised me. As I walked away from the estate, the cold wind biting at my thin uniform, I thought about how quickly a person's life can change. Just a few years ago, I didn't know what it felt like to have calloused hands or a back that ached every night before bed. I didn't know the feeling of being invisible to the people you served. It is amazing how quickly your dignity disappears when everyone around you agrees that you are worth nothing. When you wear a uniform, you become a ghost. People talk over you as if you aren't there. They spill drinks and expect you to materialize with a cloth before the liquid even hits the floor. They look through you, not at you. The Vales had spent months treating me like a piece of furniture, and eventually I had almost started to believe them. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with cleaning chemicals and scarred from small accidents in the kitchen. For a long time, I felt like those stains went all the way to my soul. I was Maeve the maid, the girl who lived in a basement apartment and skipped meals to pay for bus passes. I had accepted the role because I thought I had no choice. I thought the world had decided my fate the day my parents' car went off the road. When you lose everything at once, your home, your parents, your safety, you become desperate. And when you are desperate, you are easy to control. The Vales knew that. They preyed on it. They liked having a maid who had fallen from a better life because it made their own status feel even higher. Every time Cassian made a joke at my expense, it was to remind himself that he was at the top of the mountain and I was at the bottom. But sitting on a bus, heading back to my cramped room, I realized that mountains can crumble. I had been hiding my real self for so long that I almost forgot who Maeve Rowan was supposed to be. I was the daughter of two people who loved me, the granddaughter of a man who built an empire, and the rightful owner of a name that meant something. I had let them turn me into a victim, but the fire in my chest told me that the poor maid was a mask I was finally ready to tear off. Cliffhanger. I stared out the bus window at the passing city lights, admitting to myself the bitterest truth of all. It wasn't just the Vales who ruined me. My own family had helped push me into that job, smiling while they watched me fall. I remembered the day my Uncle Silas sat me down after the funeral. He didn't offer a hug or a place to stay. Instead, he told me that working as a maid for the Vales would keep me grounded. He spoke about character building and learning the value of $1, as if I hadn't just lost everything that gave my life value. He was my father's only brother, the person I was supposed to trust, yet he looked at me with eyes that were as cold as the marble in the Vale mansion. My cousins were even worse. They would visit the estate sometimes as guests of Cassian's friends. They would see me carrying trays of appetizers or cleaning up their spilled champagne, and they would joke that I was lucky to work for rich people at all. "At least you're around nice things, Maeve," they would say, laughing behind their hands. None of them ever offered a single dollar of help. None of them offered to let me sleep on a couch while I looked for a better job. All they gave me was advice, wrapped in thick layers of shame. They told me I was lucky to have the job because I had no skills. They told me that my parents had left behind nothing but debts, and that I should be grateful Silas had even found me a placement with a family as prestigious as the Vales. I believed them because I was grieving and alone. I didn't realize that their cruelty was a cover-up. They wanted me in that uniform because a maid can't ask questions. A maid doesn't have the power to demand an audit of a family estate. I sat in my apartment that night, the silence feeling heavier than usual. I thought about the way Silas had looked when he handed me the employment contract for the Vales. He had been so eager to see me sign it. He had been so insistent that I start fresh and leave the past behind. Every word out of his mouth for the last 3 years had been a brick in a wall designed to keep me away from the truth. He wanted me poor. He wanted me broken. He wanted me to stay in my place so he could stay in his. Cliffhanger. As I reached into my bag to find my keys, my fingers brushed against a small, crumpled piece of paper. A memory of a document my uncle had made me sign years ago, one he thought I had forgotten, but whose legal heading suddenly burned in my mind. After my parents died, the world turned into a blur of black clothing and legal paperwork. I was only 18, and the grief was a heavy fog that made it impossible to see more than a step in front of me. Uncle Silas took charge of everything. He told me there was no inheritance. He said the business had been failing for years, that the house was mortgaged to the hilt, and that there was absolutely nothing left for me to inherit. He told me there was nothing to ask about and nothing to question. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor by settling the debts so I wouldn't be hunted by collectors. I believed him, not because I was stupid, but because I was young, exhausted, and completely alone. When you are drowning, you don't ask the person throwing you a rope if the rope is made of gold or straw. You just grab it. I spent years believing I was a burden. I spent years thinking I owed Silas for saving me from a life of debt. I took the job at the Vale estate because I felt I had to earn my keep in a world that didn't want me. I lived on ramen noodles and wore secondhand clothes while Silas moved into a bigger house and my cousins drove brand new cars. I never let myself get angry because I thought I was the unlucky one. I thought this was just how the cards had been dealt. But tonight, as I sat on my lumpy mattress, I realized that cards are often dealt from a crooked deck. If there was truly nothing left, why was Silas so scared of me talking to anyone from my father's old life? Why did he insist I change my phone number and cut ties with our old neighbors? The more I thought about it, the more the facts he gave me started to look like carefully constructed lies. I had been a maid for 3 years, and if there's one thing you learn while cleaning up after the wealthy, it's how to spot when someone is trying to hide a mess. I wasn't the daughter of a bankrupt man. My father was a Rowan. The Rowans didn't just disappear into poverty overnight. There was a missing piece to this puzzle, and it was hidden behind the character building my uncle loved to talk about. Cliffhanger. Just then, a heavy thud sounded at my door. I looked down to see a thick, official-looking bank letter that had been slid through the mail slot, addressed to Maeve Rowan, beneficiary. The letter felt heavy in my hand, the paper thick and expensive, the kind of paper the Vales used for their gala invitations. I opened it with trembling fingers. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a notice of eviction. It was a summary of a dormant account, a courtesy notice sent to my new address that Silas clearly didn't know I had. News spreads fast in wealthy circles, and apparently the banking world was starting to wake up to something I hadn't yet realized. The letter didn't just talk about money. It hinted at a web of connections I couldn't fully grasp yet. But while I was staring at the bank's logo, I started thinking about the Vale estate I had just been kicked out of. Working there, you hear things. You hear the hushed arguments in the study when the doors aren't quite latched. You see the past due notices hidden under piles of glossy magazines. Cassian's family was bleeding money. They put on a grand show, with the parties and the cars and the expensive porcelain vases, but the foundation was rotting. I had seen the staff getting cut back one by one. I had seen the repairs on the roof being delayed for months while Mrs. Vale bought a new diamond necklace. The estate wasn't as untouchable as it looked from the outside. It was a giant, gilded cage that was slowly running out of birdseed. I realized then that the Vales and my Uncle Silas were two sides of the same coin. They both relied on the illusion of power to keep people beneath them. Cassian mocked me to feel big, while Silas kept me poor to keep me quiet. But the Vales were in trouble. Creditors were circling the estate like sharks in a feeding frenzy. If the Vales fell, they would fall hard. The letter in my hand mentioned a trust structure. It mentioned protective clauses and heir-at-law triggers. Most importantly, it mentioned a name that sent a shock through my system. It was a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in over a decade because Silas told me he was dead. Cliffhanger. The bank letter explicitly mentioned a trustee I needed to contact immediately. A man named Evander Rowan. Evander Rowan, my grandfather. The man my uncle told me had abandoned our family and died in shame in another country. According to Silas, Evander was a gambler who had squandered the Rowan legacy before I was even born. I grew up believing I had no grandparents, no elders to turn to, just the bitter memory of a man who didn't care. But as I stood in a small, dusty office downtown the next morning, I realized that Silas was a better liar than I ever gave him credit for. Evander Rowan wasn't dead, and he certainly hadn't abandoned us. He was standing right in front of me. He was tall, with a mane of white hair and eyes that looked exactly like my father's. He didn't look like a gambler. He looked like a king who had been waiting for his kingdom to be returned to him. "Maeve," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out a hand but stopped, as if afraid I would disappear. He explained that Silas had blocked every attempt he made to contact me. Silas had told the courts that Evander was unfit, and then told me that Evander was gone. It was a double-sided wall of lies designed to keep the Rowan fortune in Silas's greedy hands while keeping the rightful heir, me, scrubbing floors for the Vales. Evander had been fighting a quiet legal battle for years to get to me. He had been tracking my uncle's movements, watching as Silas slowly drained the liquid assets of the family trust. But the trust had a fail-safe. My father had set it up so that the bulk of the Rowan wealth, the real power, could only be accessed when I reached a certain age or if I was found to be in a position of extreme hardship caused by the current trustee. My time as a maid wasn't just a job, it was evidence. Silas had forced me into servitude to keep me from my inheritance, and by doing so, he had accidentally triggered the very clauses that would strip him of everything. Evander looked at me, his eyes burning with a mixture of pride and fury at what I had endured. Cliffhanger, Evander leaned across the desk, his voice dropping to a serious growl as he asked the one question that rattled my entire world. "Maeve, did they ever let you read the actual terms of the trust?" While I was discovering the truth of my bloodline, the Vales were busy making sure the rest of the world saw me as a joke. Cassian, never one to let a good story go, had posted the video of my firing. He titled it, "The World's Most Expensive Clumsiness," and added a soundtrack of circus music. It was designed to be viral, and it worked. I sat in a coffee shop with my grandfather, watching the view count climb. The comments were a nightmare. Strangers who didn't know my name or my story were mocking my hands, calling them peasant paws. They laughed at my cheap shoes and the way I looked terrified as the vase shattered. They talked about my worth as if I were an object. "Some people are just born to serve," one comment read. "Glad she got what was coming to her," said another. I felt a wave of the old shame trying to pull me under, but then I felt Evander's hand on mine. He wasn't looking at the comments with hurt. He was looking at them with a cold, calculated focus. He was a man who understood power, and he saw exactly what Cassian was doing. Cassian was trying to destroy my reputation so that even if I did find a way to fight back, no one would believe a clumsy, poor maid. "He thinks he's won because he has a camera and a crowd," Evander said quietly. "He doesn't realize he's just handing us the rope to hang him with. Public humiliation is a two-edged sword, Maeve. Right now, he's holding the handle. Soon, he'll be holding the blade." I realized then that the Vales weren't just mean. They were desperate for relevance. Their family business was a hollow shell, and Cassian's social media presence was the only thing keeping the illusion alive. He needed to look superior because, underneath the designer clothes, he was terrified of being exactly what I had been, someone with nothing. Cliffhanger, my grandfather closed the laptop slowly, his face a mask of iron, and said, "Let him post. Every like on that video is another nail in his coffin." He watched the video one last time in total silence. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal documents and revelations. Evander took me to a private vault where the true Rowan trust was kept. As I read the papers, the scale of the betrayal became clear. The trust was massive, holding properties, stocks, and land that Silas had never mentioned. But the most shocking part was the safeguard mechanism. The trust was designed to stay dormant, managed by a trustee, until the primary heir, me, turned 25. However, there was a specific clause. If the trustee ever acted in bad faith by intentionally lowering the heir's standard of living below a certain threshold to hide assets, the trust would automatically activate an early emergency distribution to the heir and strip the trustee of all power. By forcing me to work as a maid and telling me I was broke, Silas had committed the ultimate legal blunder. He thought he was being clever, keeping me grounded, so I wouldn't look for the money. Instead, he had provided the exact legal grounds Evander needed to take him down. Every hour I spent scrubbing the Vale's floors was another piece of evidence of Silas's bad faith. But there was more. The Rowan Trust didn't just hold money, it held debt. Specifically, it held the primary mortgage and several massive business loans belonging to Vale Enterprises. My father and Evander had been the silent partners and creditors for the Vales for decades. The very house I had been fired from, the very floor I had mopped, was essentially tied to my family's money. I looked at my grandfather, my head spinning. "So, you're saying I don't just have money, I have their debt." Evander smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "In this world, Maeve, owning someone's debt is better than owning their friendship. The Vales have been defaulting on their payments for months. They think they're fighting off a faceless bank. They don't know the bank has a name." Cliffhanger, he tapped a specific line on the final page and told me the words that changed everything. "The Vale estate is tied directly to this trust, and the creditors are ready to move." The phone started ringing that afternoon. It was my Uncle Silas. His voice was different, no longer the cold, authoritative tone he used when telling me to be grateful for my job. Now, he sounded sweet, almost frantic. He asked if I was okay after being fired, saying he'd just heard the news and was so worried about his favorite niece. "I heard you might be talking to some old family acquaintances," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You know, Maeve, people get confused as they get older. They tell stories. You shouldn't believe everything you hear. Why don't you come over for dinner? We can talk about finding you a new, better position." I sat in my grandfather's office, looking at the high-end furniture and the city skyline, and for the first time in my life, I lied well. I kept my voice soft and slightly shaky, playing the role of the broken girl he expected me to be. I told him I was just staying with a friend and trying to figure things out. I told him I hadn't talked to anyone important. I could almost hear his sigh of relief through the phone. He thought he still had me under his thumb. He thought I was still the poor maid who was too scared to look him in the eye. He didn't know that I was sitting next to the man he had spent 10 years trying to erase. He didn't know that every word he said was being recorded by a legal team. "That's a good girl," Silas said. "Just stay put. And whatever you do, don't answer any calls from people claiming to be Rowans. There are scammers out there, Maeve. They'll try to take advantage of your situation." The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. The biggest scammer in my life was currently calling me honey and pretending to care about my dinner. I hung up the phone and looked at Evander. The game was on. Cliffhanger, before Silas hung up, his voice turned sharp for just a second as he issued a final warning. Maeve, promise me, whatever happens, you won't talk to Evander. He's a dangerous man. The news hit the papers 2 days later, and it wasn't the kind of news the Vales could spin with a viral video. Vale Enterprises faces liquidation, the headlines screamed. Creditors, led by a mysterious holding company that Evander and I controlled, had finally moved in. They weren't just asking for payments anymore, they were demanding the collateral. The Vales had used the estate itself as a guarantee for loans they couldn't repay. They thought they could keep rolling the debt over, but Evander had spent the last 48 hours buying up every scrap of their debt from other banks. We had become their sole creditor. We held the keys to their kingdom, and we were done being patient. Auction notices began to appear. First, they were quiet, sent to private investors. Then, they were posted publicly on the gates of the estate. The very gates I had walked out of with my head down were now plastered with legal warnings. The Vales were being sued for everything they had. The facade was crumbling in real time. I watched the news from a safe distance, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering sadness. I didn't want to be a person who enjoyed someone else's downfall, but then I remembered the way Mrs. Vale had screamed at me. I remembered Cassian's smirk. I remembered the hush money they had refused to pay me for the docked paycheck. They hadn't just been rich, they had been cruel. And cruelty has a very high interest rate. The public reaction was immediate. The same people who had laughed at the video of me breaking the vase were now mocking the Vales for losing their home. The internet turned on them faster than a pack of wolves. Cassian tried to post a video saying it was all a misunderstanding, but no one was buying it. The world loves a fall from grace almost as much as it loves a viral joke. Cliffhanger, I was scrolling through the auction listings on my phone when I saw it. The date was set, the terms were final, and the centerpiece of the sale was unmistakable. The Vale estate was officially listed for public auction. I was sitting outside a small, quiet cafe a few blocks away from my grandfather's office when a shadow fell over my table. I looked up, expecting a waiter, but instead I saw Cassian Vale. He looked different. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and the smug smirk was replaced by a nervous, twitchy smile. He didn't have his friends with him this time. He was alone, and he looked smaller. Maeve, he said, his voice cracking. I've been looking for you. Look, about the other day. The video. The vase. It was all just stress, you know. My family is going through a lot right now, and things got heated. We didn't mean any of it. I stayed silent, sipping my tea. I watched him sweat. He was so used to people jumping when he spoke that my silence was clearly unnerving him. He sat down without being invited, leaning in close. He smelled like expensive cologne and desperation. Listen, he whispered. We know you're connected to the Rowans now. We heard rumors. If you help us talk to your grandfather, if you get him to back off the auction, we can make it worth your while. I can give you hush money, enough to live comfortably for years, more than you'd ever make as a maid. He was still doing it. Even when he was begging, he was insulting me. He still thought I was someone who could be bought with a few $1,000s. He still thought of me as the girl who was lucky to be in his presence. He didn't realize that I didn't want his money. I had my own now, and more importantly, I had the truth. I looked him dead in the eye. I didn't see the monster I had been afraid of for 3 years. I just saw a scared kid who had never been told no. I thought about the shards of the vase on the floor and the way he had joked that they were worth more than my life. Cliffhanger, I set my teacup down with a deliberate click, looked him right in his panicked eyes, and said only 2 words. I refuse. The legal process moved with a speed that only massive amounts of money can buy. My grandfather's lawyers worked around the clock, filing motions and finalizing the trustee switch. Because of Silas's documented abuse of his position, a judge signed an emergency order. Evander was legally restored as the primary trustee, but he did something more. He added my name. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just a beneficiary or a ward. My name moved from the shadows of the documents to the signature line. I was now the co-controller of the Rowan Trust. Every penny, every property, and every debt we held was now partially under my command. I spent hours signing papers, my hand cramping, but I didn't mind. Each signature felt like I was reclaiming a piece of the girl I used to be. Evander watched me with a quiet smile. "You handle power well, Maeve," he said. "Most people would be shouting from the rooftops right now. You just get to work." "I spent 3 years watching how people misuse power," I told him. "I don't want to be like them." But as the date of the auction approached, I felt a different kind of energy building in me. It wasn't a desire for revenge, exactly. It was a desire for justice. The Vales had treated their home like a fortress from which they could look down on the rest of the world. They thought they were the only ones who belonged in that world. I wanted to show them that the maid they had discarded was the one who actually held the foundation together. Evander called me into his office the night before the big day. He had a folder in front of him with the final bidding strategy. The Vales were banking on a private buyer, someone from their class, to swoop in and save the estate so they could rent it back. They were telling everyone that the auction was just a formality. Cliffhanger, Evander closed the folder, looked at me over his glasses, and asked the final question. "Everything is in place, Maeve. Are you truly ready to attend an auction?" Before the auction could even begin, the final betrayal came from my own blood. My Uncle Silas and my cousins had found out about the trustee switch. They didn't come to apologize. They didn't come to ask for forgiveness. They showed up at my grandfather's office building, screaming and accusing me of betraying the family. "We took care of you," Silas shouted as security held him back in the lobby. "We gave you a job, we kept a roof over your head, and this is how you repay us, by stealing the trust and siding with that old man." My cousins were right behind him, filming the whole thing on their phones, probably hoping to start a new viral trend to discredit me. They called me ungrateful. They told me I should remember my place, and that a maid had no business playing with millions of dollars. Their faces were twisted with a greed so pure it was almost frightening. They weren't mad that I had been treated poorly. They were mad that they couldn't spend the money I was finally reclaiming. I stood on the mezzanine, looking down at them. For years, I had been terrified of their disapproval. I had stayed in that basement apartment because I thought I owed them my silence. But looking at them now, I realized they were nothing but bullies who had run out of victims. They didn't love me. They never had. I was just a pawn in their game to keep my father's wealth for themselves. I didn't shout back. I didn't argue. I didn't even give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I realized that the only power they had over me was the power I gave them. If I didn't care about their insults, the insults had no weight. They were just noise. I turned to the security chief and gave a simple instruction. "Make sure they are escorted off the property, and please ensure their names are added to the no-entry list for tomorrow's proceedings." Cliffhanger, as I walked away from the railing, I took out my phone and did something I should have done years ago. I pulled up my contact list and blocked every single one of them. The night before the auction, the internet was buzzing. Cassian Vale was back on social media, putting on a brave face. He posted a photo of the estate's grand ballroom with a caption that read, "The auction is just a formality. Some things stay where they belong. See you all tomorrow for the rebirth of Vale Manor." He was still boasting. He was still trying to convince the world, and probably himself, that he was untouchable. He believed that his wealthy friends would outbid anyone else, or that his family's status would somehow intimidate real buyers. He had no idea that the mysterious creditor who had forced the sale was sitting in a quiet apartment, drinking tea and preparing for a very different kind of rebirth. I felt a strange sense of calm. The anxiety that had followed me for years, the fear of not having enough, the fear of being fired, the fear of being less than, had vanished. I wasn't doing this to be a millionaire. I was doing this to close a chapter of my life where I was treated like trash. I looked at the uniform I used to wear. It was still in a bag in the corner of my room, a reminder of the hours I spent on my knees scrubbing floors. I decided I wouldn't wear designer clothes to the auction. I didn't need to look like a millionaire to be one. I wanted to be me. I wanted to be the girl who knew the value of hard work, but also knew her own worth. I spent the evening talking to Evander about our plans for the estate. We weren't going to keep it as a monument to greed. We wanted to turn the grounds into something that benefited the community, maybe a school or a foundation for young people who had lost their parents. The Vales saw the estate as a throne. I saw it as an opportunity to do something right. But first, I had to win it. I had to stand in that room and face the people who had laughed at me. I had to show them that the poor maid was the one who was truly rich. Cliffhanger, I went to a small boutique downtown, ignoring the high-end labels, and bought a simple, elegant, and plain black dress. It was the dress of a woman who was ready for a funeral, the funeral of the Vale's ego. The auction hall was packed. It was held in a prestigious gallery downtown, filled with gold-leafed frames and the smell of expensive perfume. People were staring and whispering as they walked in, their eyes scanning the room for the big players. I walked in quietly, my plain black dress a sharp contrast to the sequins and silk surrounding me. At first, no one recognized me. Without my maid's apron and with my hair pulled back neatly, I looked like any other serious investor. I took a seat in the middle of the room, my back straight, my paddle resting in my lap. I felt the weight of the room, the judgment, the competition, the pure, cold scent of money. Then the Vales arrived. Mrs. Vale was draped in furs, her head held high as if she were entering a royal court rather than a foreclosure sale. Cassian was right behind her, looking around with a forced grin, nodding to people he knew. He was trying so hard to look like he was in control. His eyes swept the room, dismissive and bored, until they landed on me. He stopped mid-sentence. His brow furrowed as he tried to place my face. Then the realization hit him. I saw the moment his brain connected the girl in the black dress with the girl who broke the vase. He didn't look scared yet. Instead, a look of pure, ugly amusement washed over his face. He leaned over and whispered something to his mother, pointing in my direction. Mrs. Vale turned, her lip curling in a sneer. They couldn't believe I was there. They probably thought I had snuck in to watch their triumph or to beg for my job back. Cliffhanger, Cassian didn't look away. Instead, he let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet room, and he sat down in the front row, still chuckling as he watched me sit. The auctioneer took the podium, his voice booming through the room as he laid out the rules. This wasn't just for the house, it was for the entire estate, the land, the structures, and the history. The starting bid was higher than most people would make in a lifetime. I felt a small flutter of nerves in my stomach, but I quickly pushed it down. I wasn't a maid today. I was a Rowan. The bidding began. Cassian's family had a representative in the front row, a man in a sharp suit who immediately raised his paddle. Cassian relaxed, leaning back with his arms crossed, a smug, "I told you so" look directed at the room. He thought he had the highest bid in the bag. He thought the right class was going to win. Other wealthy bidders joined in. The numbers climbed rapidly, 5 million, 10 million, 15 million. With every jump, the room grew more tense. Bidders started dropping out, their faces tight as the price exceeded their limits. Soon, it was down to Cassian's representative and one other investor. I waited. I knew that in an auction, timing is everything. You don't jump in early and show your hand. You wait until the others think they've won. I watched Cassian's face. He was practically glowing with pride as the auctioneer called out, "Going once at 20 million. Going twice." He thought it was over. He thought the Vale name was saved. He even turned around to give me a wink, a silent, cruel game over. I felt the paddle in my hand. It felt light, but it held the weight of my parents' legacy and my own 3 years of suffering. Cliffhanger. Just as the auctioneer raised his hammer to strike the final blow, I took a deep breath and firmly raised my paddle, my voice clear and steady as I called out a number that made the entire room gasp. The auctioneer stopped mid-swing. The room went dead silent. All eyes turned to me, the girl in the plain black dress who had just jumped the bid by $5 million. I could hear the collective intake of breath. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Cassian squints at me, his eyes narrowing to slits. His smile didn't just fade, it curdled. He whispered furiously to his lawyer, his gestures getting more erratic. He was clearly demanding to know who I was and where I got that kind of money. He still didn't seem to realize that I was the creditor they had been running from. The lawyer leaned in, looking at the registration list on his tablet. I watched as his face went from annoyed to confused, and then finally to a ghostly shade of white. He recognized the name Rowan. He recognized the connection to the trust that held their debt. He whispered back to Cassian, and I saw the younger man's jaw drop. The clumsy maid wasn't just a guest, she was the competition. And unlike them, she wasn't bidding with borrowed money. I was bidding with the wealth they had tried to steal through Sela's and the debt they had failed to pay to my grandfather. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice slightly shaky as he acknowledged my bid. 25 million from the young lady in the center. Do I hear 26? Cassian's representative looked at Mrs. Vale. She was pale, her hands shaking so hard her pearls were rattling. She gave a frantic nod. The representative raised his paddle again, but his movements were no longer confident. They were desperate. They were reaching the end of their hidden reserves. Cliffhanger, I didn't even wait for the auctioneer to look at me. I raised my paddle again, adding another 2 million before they could even breathe. The lawyer pales even further, dropping his tablet onto the floor. The bidding war became a slaughter. Every time the Vale representative raised his paddle, I raised mine. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at the screen. I just kept my eyes on the auctioneer, my voice calm and rhythmic. I was a machine, fueled by years of being told I was nothing. The numbers climbed into territory that made the other investors look at each other in shock. 30 million, 35 million, 40 million. The room was buzzing with whispers. Who is she? Where did she come from? The Vales were no longer smug. They were drowning. Cassian stood up at one point, his face red, looking like he wanted to scream. He was silenced by the auctioneer, but his body language told the whole story. He was a man watching his world burn down, and the person holding the match was the girl he had filmed for a joke. The irony was a physical presence in the room, thick enough to choke on. Mrs. Vale was crying now, not soft, elegant tears, but the messy, panicked tears of someone who realized they were about to be homeless. She kept clutching at her son's arm, but he pushed her away, his eyes fixed on me with a hatred so pure it was almost impressive. He tried to signal his representative to go higher, but the man just shook his head. They were out of money. They were out of credit. They were out of time. I felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't about the money for me. It was about the fact that I didn't need their permission to exist anymore. I didn't need their mercy or their hush money. I was the one in control of the hammer now. Cliffhanger, the auctioneer called out the final bid. 45 million, going once, going twice. Cassian's representative slumped in his chair, and Cassian's final, desperate attempt to speak was drowned out by the silence of his own defeat. Sold. The word echoed through the gallery like a clap of thunder. The hammer hit the wooden block with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. The estate was mine. The house, the land, the history, all of it now belonged to Maeve Rowan. For a second, the silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that follows a massive explosion. Then the murmuring began, low and intense. I sat there for a moment, letting it sink in. I wasn't the poor maid anymore. I was the owner. I was the person who would decide what happened to the Vale's precious legacy. Cassian stood up so fast his chair tipped over. He was furious, his chest heaving. He started walking toward me, his face twisted in a mask of rage. Security immediately moved to intercept him, but I held up a hand. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. He had no power here. He was just a man in a wrinkled suit who owed me $45 million in debt I had already bought. "You think you're clever," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You think you can just buy your way into our world? You're still just a maid, Maeve. You'll always be the girl who cleans up after us." "Actually," I said, my voice carry across the room, "I'm the person you're going to have to ask for permission to pack your bags, and I suggest you do it quickly. I have a lot of renovations planned." The room erupted. People were standing, trying to get a better look at me. The Vales were surrounded by a sea of eyes, but for the first time, those eyes weren't filled with admiration. They were filled with the same cold, judgmental curiosity they usually reserved for the lower class. Cliffhanger, Cassian stood there, his mouth hanging open, looking like he wanted to say something else, but the words wouldn't come. He just stared as the realization finally, fully, hit him. The realization spread through the room like a wildfire. "That's her," someone whispered loud enough to be heard. "That's the girl from the video, the one Cassian fired." The whispers turned into a roar of recognition. The people in the gallery, the wealthy, the influential, the gossip mongers, all realized at the same time that they were witnessing the greatest reversal of fortune in the city's history. The poor Maid had just bought the mansion she used to clean. The girl they had filmed and mocked was now their peer, or rather their superior, given the size of the Rowan Trust. I saw phones coming out, but this time, the cameras weren't pointed at me to mock me. They were recording the Vale's humiliation. Silence spread again as I stood up. I didn't look at the cameras. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked directly at Mrs. Vale, who was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked like she had seen a ghost. In a way, she had. She had seen the ghost of the girl she thought she could destroy, coming back to claim everything she valued. "How," she managed to choke out, "how did someone like you get this kind of money? This is a mistake. The auction is fraudulent." The auctioneer stepped in, his voice firm. "The funds have been verified, Mrs. Vale. The bidder is a primary controller of the Rowan Trust. The sale is final and legally binding." The mention of the Rowan name was the final blow. They knew that name. They had feared it for years, ever since they started falling behind on their payments. They just never realized that the Rowan they were so afraid of was the same girl they had made scrub their toilets. Cliffhanger, Cassian stepped forward, his face pale, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit. He finally found his voice and demanded, "I want an explanation. Maeve, what did you do?" I didn't explain. I didn't justify myself to people who had laughed at my pain. Why should I? They didn't owe me an explanation when they docked my pay for a mistake I didn't make. They didn't explain why they thought it was okay to film my humiliation for the world to see. I simply walked up to the auctioneer, signed the final transfer papers, and thanked him for his time. My movements were deliberate and calm. I felt my grandfather standing behind me, a solid, silent presence of support. He didn't say a word either. We didn't need to. Our victory was written in the legal ink on those papers. As I was leaving the hall, my phone started buzzing in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a name I had blocked, but the message had somehow come through a different app. It was my Uncle Sela's. He wasn't screaming anymore. "Maeve, please," the message read. "I was wrong. I was confused. We're family, remember? Your cousins are so sorry. Let's meet and fix this. You can't do this alone." I almost laughed. Now that I had the estate, I was family again. Now that I had the power, my cousins were sorry. They weren't sorry for what they did. They were sorry that they weren't the ones standing in my shoes. They were sobbing, figuratively and literally, through their messages, trying to rewrite history to make themselves the victims. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I had already built a life that didn't require their permission or their presence. I had my grandfather, I had my dignity, and now I had the keys to the future. Cliffhanger, as I stepped out into the sunlight, my phone rang again. It was a local number. I answered it, and all I heard was the sound of my uncle sobbing on the other end, his voice broken and pathetic. The collapse of my extended family was just as swift as the Vale's. Once the word got out that Evander and I were in control of the trust, Sela's creditors, the ones he had been dodging by using my dead father's money, came for him. He had built his own lifestyle on a foundation of lies, and without the trust to prop him up, he was nothing. My relatives began to beg. They sent flowers to my grandfather's office. They posted long, rambling apologies on social media, claiming they had always supported me and that the Maid job was just a misunderstanding of my father's wishes. They were trying to rewrite the last 3 years in real time, hoping the public would buy their new version of the story. But the public has a long memory when it comes to greed. People started digging up their old posts, the ones where they mocked my character-building job. The evidence was everywhere. They were exposed for exactly what they were, parasites who had tried to feast on an orphan's inheritance. I didn't invite them back into my life. I didn't even grant them a meeting. People asked me if I felt guilty, seeing them lose their cars and their status. I thought about it, and the answer was a simple no. They hadn't felt guilty when I was skipping meals. They hadn't felt guilty when I was crying in a cold basement apartment. They were just experiencing the consequences of their own choices. I realized that forgiveness is for people who are actually sorry. My relatives weren't sorry for the pain they caused. They were sorry for the loss of their comfort. And those are two very different things. Cliffhanger. My uncle sent one final, desperate letter, promising to make it right if I just gave him one more chance to manage a small portion of the assets. I didn't even open the envelope. I just dropped it into the shredder. A week later, I walked through the gates of the Vale estate again. This time, I wasn't wearing a uniform, and I didn't have to wait for the buzzer. I had my own remote, and the gates swung open for me as if welcoming a long-lost friend. Walking the halls as the owner was a surreal experience. I walked past the spot where the vase had shattered. The shards were gone, the floor was polished to a mirror finish, but the memory was still there. I walked into the grand dining room where I had served hundreds of meals, and I sat down at the head of the table. I didn't feel like a maid pretending to be a lady. I felt like Maeve Rowan, finally standing in her own home. The staff watched me quietly. Some of them were people I had worked alongside. I saw the fear in their eyes, the fear that I would be just as cruel as the Vales had been. They stood with their heads down, waiting for me to bark orders or find fault with their work. I stood up and called them all into the ballroom. I told them that things were going to change. I told them that I knew exactly what it was like to be in their shoes, and that under my ownership, they would be treated with the respect they deserved. No more unpaid overtime. No more docked pay for accidents. No more being treated like furniture. I saw the tension leave their shoulders. I saw a few of them wipe away tears. They realized that the maid who bought the estate wasn't a threat. She was their best hope. I wasn't there for revenge on the staff who had been forced to witness my humiliation. I was there to build something better. Cliffhanger. I walked into the master study, the room where the Vales had made all their most selfish decisions, and sat at the large oak desk. I picked up the phone and made my very first official decision as the owner. My first decision was to dismantle the monument to ego the Vales had created. I sold off the fleet of luxury cars that Cassian had used to make himself feel important. I auctioned off the diamond necklaces and the furs that Mrs. Vale had used as armor against the world. I didn't need those things to feel powerful. The money from the sales didn't go back into the trust. Instead, it went into a fund to restore the estate's original purpose, a place of beauty and community. I hired back the staff I knew had been fired unfairly by the Vales over the years. I raised their wages to a level that allowed them to actually live, not just survive. I restored dignity to the place, one fair paycheck at a time. Cassian and his mother were given 48 hours to move out. I didn't kick them out onto the street immediately, not because they didn't deserve it, but because I wasn't going to let their cruelty dictate my character. I watched from the balcony as they loaded their remaining personal belongings into a modest rental truck. Cassian looked up and saw me. For the first time, there was no smirk. There was no anger. There was just a hollow, empty look of someone who finally understood that money can buy a house, but it can't buy respect. He had spent his whole life thinking he was better than me, and now he was moving into a 2-bedroom apartment while I stood on the balcony of the world he thought he owned. Mrs. Vale didn't even look up. She was too busy clutching a small jewelry box, the only thing I let her keep. She looked small and frail without her furs. I realized then that their entire identity was based on what they owned. Without the estate, they didn't know who they were. Cliffhanger. As the rental truck pulled away from the gates, I saw Cassian's face through the window one last time. He was moving out under the supervision of the very security guards he used to treat like dirt. The story of the poor maid became a legend in the city, but for me, it was just the beginning of my real life. I wasn't poor. I was simply unprotected for a while, and being unprotected taught me more about the world than any amount of money ever could. It taught me who the real monsters are, and it taught me that silence can indeed be the loudest victory of all. I renovated the estate quietly. I didn't hold a grand revenge party or invite the press to see my triumph. I didn't need the world to clap for me. I had the satisfaction of knowing that every time I walked through my front door, I was proof that dignity outlasts humiliation. I spent my afternoons with my grandfather, listening to stories about my parents that Silas had tried to bury. I learned that my father was a man of integrity and my mother was a woman of infinite kindness. I realized that my inheritance wasn't just the money or the house. It was the blood in my veins and the strength I had found in the darkness. The Vales faded into obscurity. Without their money and their estate, the friends they had cultivated disappeared overnight. They became a cautionary tale of what happens when you mistake wealth for worth. Cassian tried to start a few more viral channels, but no one wanted to watch a spoiled kid complain about his lost fortune. The world had moved on to better stories. I walked through the iron gates today, not as staff carrying groceries, and not as a woman seeking revenge. I walked through them as the rightful owner of my own destiny. I looked back at the road I had traveled, from the shattered vase to the winning hammer, and I smiled. The silence of the estate was no longer a weight, it was a promise. I wasn't the girl they broke. I was the woman who picked up the pieces and built something unbreakable. And as the sun set over the Rowan estate, I knew that the future was finally mine to write. I owned the silence they never gave me, and a future they never saw coming.